Yeah, thanks so much, John, Charlotte. Thank you all for joining and kind of taking the time today. Just introduction for myself. So I've been at Automox for about 3.5 years now. And, from a cybersecurity standpoint, that feels closer to 15 years. And so hopefully that doesn't show, but, very lucky to have gotten to talk to thousands of customers at this point at my time here. And so the plan for today is just share some of those anecdotes with you all, right? Especially where that relates to financial institutions. I figured it's better to keep it interactive, right? It's a long day. We all thought it was Friday when we joined this call, and it turns out it's not. So, just want to make it as beneficial and hopefully enjoyable as possible. So, that being said, I did put together like a quick deck slideshow, and if time permits too, I'm a see it to believe it person, so happy to go through a technical demo with people on this call, and then we'll send all this over as well. So I believe this is being recorded. We're going to have this deck sent over as a resource. But from an agenda standpoint, this whole provide solutions, not just problems, is a big part of Automox's specific mission, and a lot of what I've been researching in the space in my time here. And kind of what I mean to that, and John's earlier point, is there's a ton of risk in the space right now. And I feel like there's a lot of tools that do a good job of telling you what's wrong, right? Telling you where your issues are, telling you it's wrong, alerting you 1,000,000 times a day. And so we'll kind of highlight that problem a little bit, but I think the key here is how do we help, right? How do we leverage technology to be specifically proactive in our risk reduction? Where is that proof? And then obviously more Q&A for anyone that has it. So if that sounds good to everybody, the way I think about the problem that I'm sure a lot of you all here in IT and security see when it comes to risk reduction is kind of like a tool problem, a volume problem, and a time problem are the three things that we see most frequently and we think about. And so, from a tool problem standpoint, I would say a majority of companies are still using very legacy tools because that's all that's really existed in the space to patch, to remediate, to reduce risk, right? So when I say legacy, think about I have to stand up a server to maintain this, or some level of, VM or cloud gateway, or it's VPN dependent. And that creates for a lot of complexity, a lot of inconsistencies. It's not accurate. It's very miserable to use, right? As far as just being very tedious and zero automation, right? Zero intelligence behind these tools. It's purely up to humans and the teams to kind of figure out how to heal the environment. And so kind of brings me to the second point, the volume problem. If you look at, published CVEs over the past about 10 years, they've more than quadrupled, right? And so I do like to ask this question. Well, I know the hours in the day haven't quadrupled. That one I can confirm, but has anyone on this call had their security or IT teams quadruple in the past few years? We had any big teams growing? Okay, I'm gonna guess no. Sometimes there's one person that says, yeah, we have, and then I'm like, great, you've got money, we'll talk. But beyond that, like most teams aren't quadrupling, right? If anything, they're kind of shrinking. You have to do less with more, and everything that you all hear and And so, it's becoming a little bit of a losing battle and an emotional one for them as well. I have massive risk, like John mentioned at the beginning, that's increasing for me, for my teams, for my organization. I have a lot of legacy tools to deal with it. And then you've also got this time problem, which is another interesting statistic of, on average, it's still taking organizations over 100 days to completely remediate critical vulnerabilities, whether that's a patch, that's a misconfiguration. And like, I thought 100 when I first saw this sounds a little bit extreme. But again, when you think about, well, now we've got remote workforces, we've got servers and desktops and virtual machines, and we have hundreds of third-party applications. We have all this stuff changing. It's not that unbelievable, right? But that delta is increasing where it's taking us longer because of that tool problem and that volume problem. But it's taking attackers less time to actually exploit those critical vulnerabilities. We're seeing about a week, right, for them on average to exploit critical vulnerabilities. And so, really what we look at from a how do we quantify this and how do we help, our goal is to get, our customers, all customers, remediating critical infrastructure within 24 hours, right? So massive difference for 102 days. And, that really does come down to a few key things about the architecture of the tool, the intelligence of the tooling systems, and, what's now available today. So, any questions on kind of the problems, time problem, volume problem, tool problem? Otherwise, I will get into, I'll get into some of the meat of this. So kind of, I mentioned before, right? How are we going from 100+ days to 24 hours for the most part, as far as critically or reducing critical vulnerabilities? And as you can guess from the title, a lot of that has to do with the idea of a proactive risk reduction approach and compliance and the baseline we set for us, rather than this very reactive approach of, okay, as I see all these vulnerabilities, then I have to go and I have to fix it. I have to sign people and make the time. And a few other keys there, just from the architecture side, is Automox was the first cloud native security, or cloud native security tool for remediation, IT patching, and hardening in the space, right? So we've got a lot of CrowdStrike founders and folks that you think about EDR, in a world of Symantec's and Kaseya's. How were we able to scale, make this not VPN dependent, make this zero to deployed to doing things in your environment in minutes? And a cloud native architecture is pretty critical for that, and kind of critical for that 24 hours that you see from a remediation standpoint. So really, really fun to be able to say that as far as being the first cloud native tool. But as far as slashing more of that complexity, right, being the first tool to also just consolidate that. It's very rare that companies have purely one operating system in the environment today. And then, last architecture bit is also integrations. I'll talk about and how we're trying to streamline that from an automation standpoint to reduce risk, because, most companies don't have just one tool in the environment. There's different security tools that do different things. So how do we optimize that as much as possible, whether that is with AI or, with the API and different types of workflows that we've built out. And then, so from a functionality standpoint, where you see that automation and really that intelligence is kind of 3 pillars here. First is patching, right? So this is a pretty well-known issue. I think this is really what, if you've heard of Automox, most people know about us from. It's also one of those spaces where, like I said, talked to thousands of customers at this point. And I haven't talked to anybody who has said, like, I love patching. It's the best part of my day. It's really fun. There's no problems with it. I really look forward to it. My team loves it. Right. So kind of one of those things that is an issue for most organizations for one reason or another that I'll get into. And then also, you look at this second pillar. I personally think this is the most powerful piece of any type of automation or intelligence, at least within our platform, and that's the configuration side of it, right? If you look at, well, what does it mean for something to be a security risk, but it's not a patch? I'll touch on PCI a little bit. I'll touch on, 0 days and things that are definitely keeping financial institutions up at night, but it's not as simple as a patch. And so knowing that I can automate that I can leverage AI that I'll show you in a moment to go from plain text to script fix, it's pretty incredible, right? Where we've come from. And then general control, right? That brings back some of that ROI, that brings back some of that, consolidation, getting rid of other tools, whether that's a remote control tool, so on and so forth. So this is kind of the core of the platform and what we're seeing here, right? And what this tool is typically doing for customers. So I wanted to go into each pillar a little bit, give you an idea of what that's actually talking about and how that can be relevant to you all. And then also, like I said, follow it up potentially with a demonstration. So you talk about patching first and foremost. Like I said, this has been an age-old pain for companies. And a lot of that goes back to that tool problem. Hey, it's extremely manual. It's extremely inaccurate, time consuming, cumbersome. But now I've got, thousands and thousands of patches each year that are getting released, more than the last year and the year before that. I've got remote workforces. I've got multiple operating systems, VMs. Like I said, I've got hundreds of third-party titles. So, when we took an approach to patching, not just being a cloud native solution, but what is the intelligence behind that we can put into place to proactively reduce risk? And so our patch policies are designed in a way for companies to be able to say, this is what it means for me to be compliant, right? This is what it means for me to be secure, to be compliant. And that's going to differ for every company. But a good example being, right, for PCI at least itself, I need criticals patch within 30 days, right? And from my standpoint, I probably want it done a lot more aggressively than that, especially if I have tooling that allows for it. So I want to be patched within, 24 hours. Put in a policy where if we see something critical come through, that is the SLA that is being met today. And that's typically the biggest pain we see with all of our financial institutions. Don't feel like they're meeting SLAs correctly because they just simply can't, right? With everything else going on in their day, the tooling they have today, and with that volume. And so that baseline of not just patching, operating systems, which is pretty well known, but as your company continues to add third-party applications, as they continue to scale and add devices, kind of this bottom line I'll touch on a little bit more later, but I mean, it truly does result in hundreds of hours of saved time for these teams, right? Because they've gone from having to micromanage this weekly or monthly to, hey, I've set a policy of automation and what it means for me to be compliant. Automox executes on that, and I can check in, I can stop things if I want it paused, I can continue, I can accelerate, I can scale within minutes a week rather than hours and hours a week. Right. And so patching, I said, is an interesting one too, because this is a pretty direct correlation to the PCI line number 6, right, that our companies come to us about having secure practices in place. And I believe it's 6.2, the regulation, but does mention specifically patching criticals within 30 days if possible. But it's interesting because I pulled this from the website and linked the source as well if anyone's interested in learning more. But I think the more interesting thing here is what's the risk, right? Especially with your roles and your companies, that risk appetite is a conversation that, I'm sure you're having or are going to have more and more as time progresses. And, most organizations want to accept less risk appetite rather than more. And so when you look at, PCI saying 80% of hacks and, attacks could be prevented by strengthening passwords, that's a configuration, if you remember. So not just a patch, but also installing patches. I'll take that risk reduction any day if I can do those two things with a tool and do it consistently and easily. And we're actually seeing this number rise because it's just an easy source of attack, right? It's not complex to take advantage of unpatched software for these attackers. And they know companies are lagging behind more and more because of, again, that time problem, tool problem, volume problem. So, there's definitely best practices. Just notes that a lot of the best practices tend to be very cumbersome for teams, again, if they don't have a tool and a protocol in place. And so I thought this was directly relevant to everybody on that call. And I will say, if you're not having those risk appetite conversations, it's definitely interesting to think about. Maybe if you're a smaller organization and a conversation to lead for your organization, whether that has to do with tooling or not, and it just has to do with you as an organization, it sets the stage for very kind of quantifiable improvements that you can have that I'll talk about a little bit more in the proof section. So that being said, like I said, I think everybody knows what patching is and knows it's a problem, as I mentioned, but the configuration piece is always very interesting to me, because even if you saw on that last, page, how do I improve password complexity as an example to help reduce that risk for me? How do I say, I don't want people using USB on their remote devices, right? I want to make sure firewalls are configured in a certain way to, again, meet PCI requirements. I want to uninstall an application, right? Not install it or not patching it because it's causing a ton of vulnerabilities. And from an audit and compliance standpoint, I don't need this application in the environment. How do I keep it off there? So again, that intelligence and that automation is a massive part of what we've termed worklets, but it's really scriptable automation. And there's a few ways we go about this, right? So At its core, it's PowerShell and Bash. So if your teams have script savvy engineers and there's already workflows they're trying to automate, they're more than welcome to kind of translate those workflows into the tool, consolidate it, report on it. The second piece is that artificial intelligence that John was talking about, right? Which is especially interesting to a lot of organizations, just because for the most part, they don't have those resources, right? They don't have super script savvy teams that just have the time to do all this. And so what we've done with that AI is allowed for our teams to say, again, in plain text, essentially, write me a script, right, to disable USB usage on my Windows devices, right? And then what that engine will do is create that PowerShell script, and I'll show this during the demo, in a way that you can now run or automate and control. Add that back to your baseline of compliance for your organization, within minutes. And so the use cases there are pretty infinite, but that third way that we're going about this configuration automation intelligence is also just our human engineering team now kind of creating these pre-built automations with the workload catalog. And so a lot of that has to do with CIS hardening, PCI, right? 0 days as they come out, general configuration asks, maintenance tasks. So this engineering team is basically going out there and saying, hey, these are the hundreds and kind of growing asks we know there are for our companies. I want them to be able to run this and add this as a baseline to their compliance out of the box for that proactive risk reduction, right? So the 10,000 vulnerabilities I'm getting because Flash is installed in the environment, I'm immediately reducing to 0 because I'm just not letting Flash be installed. And if it's ever in the environment, Automox uninstalls it, right? Back to that PCI slide, password complexity, right? Being able to create or use an out-of-the-box worklet that says, click of a button, make sure at all times any users on my network have a password that's at least 12 characters long and includes some sort of, special character, capitalization, so on and so forth, right? Again, click of a button. Projects that sometimes take teams months, right? Think about consistent uninstalls, think about configuration changes. And then this final pillar on the right-hand side, think about when there is a security concern, when there is a 0 day that is impacting your environment potentially, and you're at risk as a financial institution, everything stops, right? Everything stops, and all attention, all man hours, all dollars are put towards fixing that from an IT and security perspective. And I think an interesting use case here is like Log4j, just because that thing's 2.5 years old at this point. And it's still one of the biggest risks that vulnerability scanners like Rapid7 and Tenable are seeing for their entire customer base, right? Mainly because even though there is technically a patch available, it's part of a lot of systems and code for companies. And so they can't just update. And so what we've done is we've created within this workload catalog a fix for Log4j that you can, again, run with a click of a button that doesn't include, updating. It actually opens up the jar itself and makes adjustments so that you're not vulnerable, you're clear of any false positives, and you're not causing any disruption to the workforce. And so this example on the right-hand side here is, what did that look like? This is specific to a Microsoft 0 day, but what does that typically look like for Automox? And this was an example of, within 48 minutes, not only did Automox detect and the team realized there was a 0 day patch, part of the Patch Tuesday release, but we created a custom worklet to remediate that 0 day within 48 minutes. And within, less than an hour and a half, our customers were deploying that across, thousands and thousands of their endpoints. Right. So I think that's a really, really fun story because, and if you ask your teams, if you're not specifically on the security or IT team, hey, does it typically take 2 hours for a 0 day? Like, what does that look like? There's a ton of financial and risk implications to being able to proactively and quickly remediate these instances. So John, in the chat, just to your point, I'll absolutely share that workload catalog. There's some more upwards of 500 use cases now, but you can look at that, you can share those with your teams, and it's kind of a fun thing because you can go through and say, hey, yeah, that was a project that honestly was a pain for our team, or maybe this is an upcoming project, and here's how we can use that intelligence to streamline it, right, to help. And so, like I said, this is kind of a quick view of what that catalog looks like, but I'll show you within the demo part. But again, because you can really monitor any condition, you can measure that state, you can deploy, you can take action. There's a ton that you're adding to your automated baseline of compliance than just patching. So, like I said, you can't tell already, I am pretty passionate about the worklets. I just think they bring a massive value add to the financial institutions we work with, especially because you're held to certain standards that some organizations just aren't, and they can get away with, a lot slower of a workflow. So last thing I wanted to talk about, just as far as the proactive risk reduction point goes, is like the importance of those integrations, but specifically, the integration to, since we're talking about being proactive here, right, proactive risk reduction with vulnerability scanners. And I kind of started this conversation off with, there are a ton of tools that tell you what's wrong. From a proactive standpoint, how do we take this process of, here's a bunch of issues in my environment, wherever source that came from, right? Audits, the actual vulnerability reports, vulnerability scanners, and how do we make it proactive? Right. And so what we're seeing is with certain integrations and that baseline that I was talking about, you setting as an organization, whether that's with the artificial intelligence and the configuration, whether it's patching policies and automation, right? Companies are proactively remediating risk up to 90% just off the bat, right? Within a day's work of setting this up, right? Because John kind of mentioned or asked in the comments, like, what are some of the challenges specific to third-party applications, right? Typically, again, from a volume standpoint, people have hundreds of third-party applications in the environment, right? If you don't have a tool to centralize, what you're left doing is trying to put on auto update, right? Which, if you're like me and you never close out Chrome, as an example, you've got your tabs open, bunch of users, there needs to be some level of control to enforce a level of compliance for you and your organizations, right? So third party typically is the biggest challenge for companies over operating system, because you've got such a large number, you've got hundreds of sources if you've got those applications where the patches are actually coming from. And they're constantly releasing updates. There's no rhyme or reason. It's not a patch Tuesday with Windows, right? It's oh shoot, another Zoom update, another Google Chrome update every single week. And so that's part of the importance of this proactive risk reduction, is basically setting that baseline, saying, if you ever see a Chrome update, patch it within 3 days. If you ever see Zoom needing an update, patch it within 3 days. Adobe, right? Some of the biggest risks as well when it comes to security concerns. And so that's part of, a lot of this intelligence is setting that baseline for your organization and being proactive so that you get those numbers that show immediate results in the environment. Right. And so it kind of just shows from a very episodic point in time, reactive that we talked about, the way that we're doing essentially is an automated daily sync, and then using that intelligence to bucket, okay, well, what's patchable coming from my scanner like Rapid7? What's a configuration management, whether that's registry key change, uninstall, USB, log4j, to, any type of gap coverage too for unknown devices. And so this, I think, is probably most interesting, especially for financial institutions, right? If we have CFOs on this call, if we have IT and security leaders on this call, I think the best part about the proactive risk reduction and intelligence conversations is that the results are very quantifiable, right? And what I mean by that is, if you look at, even just as an example, the rapid deployment, right? We typically onboard customers, whether it's for testing or, fully if they've purchased the tool, 0 to deploying the thing to actually doing something, whether it's, executing an automation, using AI to create a script in 5 minutes, right? In minutes, that's really what it takes. And so, when you're an organization where speed is really important and scale is really important, it is really exciting to be able to say, hey, I took something where this tool that we previously had, was taking hours to manage or set up, That's manpower, right? That's cost, that's money. And I was able to turn that into, a tooling and a process that scales as we get new team members, or there's any churn. Again, we're not months behind from a lag perspective or an enablement perspective. Middle column as well is a really fun one to talk to, because this is that risk, right, to the financial organization. And so being able to show, hey, when we onboarded a tool or when we onboarded a process, this is what our risk was at. We had thousands of outstanding patches. We had thousands of misconfigurations in the environment. And we were able to reduce that with that thoughtful automation that we've put into place, with that intelligence that we now have. But I think the best part of this is not just reducing it initially, but keeping it there, right? And the reason I say that is because, hey, I've seen a lot of people put in the time, put in the effort to reduce that risk for the organization, and then it goes right back up, right? Patch Tuesday happens, the third-party applications we were just talking about release new updates. There's a new 0 day, every other week, every other day at this point. And so I'm not just letting it reduce and then it shoots back up. I'm creating a baseline again of that compliance, right? So you're keeping it there because you're saying, for my organization, this is what it means, and this is the automation this tool is going to execute for me if we come across a situation. And then, again, final pillar here is very interesting, because this goes directly to that ROI for organizations. And so what we've seen in our organizations internally is over 90% lower cost of admin and operations. If you look at the time they're now spending in a tool and able to work on other projects, repurpose employees, to just actual results happening. There's no infrastructure, there's no VPNs, they're able to consolidate a lot of tools. And so, the reason I think all three of these are very important, especially because I know for financial institutions, this gets looked at very critically, right? But if you take a step back and you look at the IT and security professionals, I know that we're not very, this is maybe not the best way to put it, but often we're not very good at advocating for ourselves, right? Like IT and security professionals are kind of known as the wizards behind the scene that makes the thing happen and that makes the company secure. But when you think about, okay, for myself and my organization, how do I sort of advocate for the work that I'm doing? This conversation of thoughtful automation and proactive risk reduction, I think, is a really, really good one for, teams and leaders to be able to say, I'm not just back there behind a curtain making things happen. This is how I'm truly impacting the risk appetite of this org and reducing it. This is how I'm saving this company money and time, and all of that goes into, the success of a financial institution, especially. So, maybe a little bit off topic, but I do enjoy that part of the conversation a lot with these organizations. And, I think you should hold your tools accountable to that too. Like, what are the actual results that I'm seeing here that impact me and my role and my day-to-day in my company? So I think from a timing perspective too, that's really what I had just for slides, right? And was hoping to go through a quick demo if people were still interested. John, I know you had a question. Does Automox have any mechanism to identify and mitigate gaps where patching is not available? So mitigation, absolutely. The detection of actual vulnerabilities is typically a vulnerability scanning tool. So like when I brought up this slide of Tenable, Rapid7, Qualys, CrowdStrike, like there's a whole separate stack of security tools that that's all they do, right? Well, not all they do, but that's what they do, right? So Automox, the best way to think about it is we're that fix engine. So all these tools will tell you what's wrong and where the gap is. Automox will then take that gap, whether that's different threat feeds, different toolings, from specific to the configuration piece, and say, okay, well now, this is how you fix it.
Thanks. Yeah, part of where I see some opportunity with AI is to focus on the real issues and sort of reduce the noise. And I know from my own personal experience that at a high level, if you're running an organization from a finance perspective, and you just want to see where are my threats, right? Where do I need to be worried? It's a little tough sometimes because there's so many legacy patches that didn't happen. There's these other activities that, so something that can sort out and say these are actual risks and things of that nature, I think would be immensely helpful to folks on this call.
Yeah, that's the threat exposure management space you're talking about has been a really interesting one to watch grow. And they basically take exactly that, right? All this intelligence and what's really relevant to my organization. And then again, the unfortunate piece is even those tools don't fix it. They just help you prioritize that. So those are the same tools we would integrate with, right? Or the same tools that we would be able to say, hey, based off of your specific prioritization, here's the automation, here's the baseline. And we can use the intelligence to actually create that fix, right? Because again, sometimes or a lot of the time, they don't even point you towards what that fix is. So it's definitely a relevant topic, right? Because there's that whole alert fatigue. I don't even want to know I have these many problems if I can't start to chip away at them and make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's also a case of just being able to identify the real issues as opposed to something that's been raised that either is not an issue or doesn't meet the threshold, your risk thresholds, if you will, in terms of what you want to address. And I've been on plenty of calls or in plenty of meetings where you're trying to get the CFO and the CEO to sign off on your quarterly reports, and they're looking at 10 dashboards from different channels in the organization, and they're trying to make sense out of what is the risk and what do I need to be worried about, right? So
yeah, 100%, right? And the reporting is a big part of it too, to your point, or like showing those results is super important as well. And that was a good, the Log4j, part of what we do to that point, right, John, though we're not the find tool, we're the fix tool. Part of that is like Log4j was a ton of false positives for companies because these scanners are just checking for a version, right? So some of the intel, and you could have an older version and still not be vulnerable depending on the contents of that version. And so that was something that we put a check in when it came to the actual config management side of the house, to be able to say, I don't just care about the version, right? I need to know in the contents of the jar file itself, am I vulnerable? And so there is a level of, though we're a fixed tool, you do need to make sure that you are supporting, because we have this intelligence to do and to read things and to monitor things. Make sure that we are supporting the scanning tools, because again, it's a lot of noise and it's very difficult to understand what to do, how to do it, and then actually go and do it. Definitely. Any questions for the rest of the group? Otherwise, like I said, happy to go through a quick 10-minute demonstration just so you can see it if anybody's interested in seeing it. Mainly just the ease of use, right? Some of the stuff we talked about and how we start to put in those automations, the AI piece of plain text to, creating those scripts. So, all righty. What I'll do is I'll pull up my demo environment now and stop sharing this one, so you all can kind of see a little bit of what that looks like. And like I said, if you are on the security side and less so the finance side, you will see very different take than a lot of these legacy tools, right? A lot of the compliance and the SLAs that we talked about is highlighted very easily. Troubleshooting is very easy as far as, what that actually looks like. What's the work this tool is doing for me? What are the outcomes, which is definitely interesting, even from a financial standpoint. What's the automation we have in place? Kind of that device health, right? What does that look like? So kind of when I started out, was not that good, the device health standpoint. And now we're doing a lot better as far as how we are executing those automations. So a lot of the things in the tool, just to John's earlier point, are asset information and inventory, software visibility. So, do we have intelligence to see specifically for, missed patches? Absolutely, right? What packages are missing? What devices are impacted? How long Have they been exposed? Is there criticality associated with any of these, right? Already I'm going over a week of a cumulative update not being patched, and it's a critical. So sorting, reporting, all of that is available here. But again, just for the sake of today's topic, wanted to spend 5 minutes on that automation and that proactive risk reduction. And if you remember, that's the policies I called them. And this is basically what makes my device compliant, my organization secure. And it falls into those 3 categories you saw, right? Patching, control with software deployment and requirements, and then also the workloads, which is that configuration, scriptable management, right? Anything you need to do on the different operating systems. So just to show you kind of that quick baseline and the SLA adherence, right, specific to PCI as well, the best way to think about the patching policies here is what you want to patch, who, and when, right? So again, to keep it informed with how quickly it is for our team to now execute on this rather than before, I know that for PCI, I need to make sure that, okay, now what is severity? I'm going to say criticals need to be patched every 30 days or at least once a month, right? But the fun part is I can make that a little bit more aggressive and from a scheduler standpoint, say, once a week. And I still have the flexibility to not disrupt my end users, critical C-suite executives, certain blackout times that we don't want people getting rebooted or updated. And so, within 60 seconds, we've created a policy that doesn't require my team to do manual reactive work. It proactively looks for these missing updates. And when it notices them, it'll deploy either on the schedule that I decide or from an age date, right? If I do like a patch advanced. And so, again, like it's a totally different feel and mindset from how we have been remediating risk in our environment previously. And so I definitely think it's worth having those conversations of what is our process today? How can we improve it, right? How can we have those conversations? So we're saying it's not every meeting saying, well, we can't meet these SLAs, right? Here's why, or there's XYZ that keeps coming up. And rather, hey, we've reduced our risk 90%. We've done it in a way that's also saving the business money because it's taking less time, less resources. So that was a quick patching example, but if you go back to the config management too, as I mentioned, there's a whole world of, well, now what about everything that's not patchable? And so that's that workload, if you remember, where yes, you have the ability to script. So if your team is already doing certain automations, they can script it. But I wanted to show this little robot here because this is our AI, right, input and chat box basically that allows you to go from, plain text to automations and configurations. And there's basically 2 parts to it, right? Evaluation code check for something. So kind of to John's point earlier, hey, either sanity check me or look for something or monitor for something. And then based off this result, kind of an if then, if you find something, remediate it. So a very simple example being, write me a PowerShell script that checks if SMBv1 is enabled. Again, don't have to be a PowerShell guru, don't have to know what this means. But now one of the biggest legacy vulnerabilities that's there with a lot of Windows machines still, and very critical, kind of checks, hey, is it enabled? Writes the output, is it not enabled? And now I can kind of go and say, okay, great. Write me a PowerShell script so that if SMBv1 is enabled, it disables it. Let's just get rid of my chatter. And like I said, right there, we've gone and taken a process that, is extremely cumbersome to be able to check and balance for, take care of configuration issues. And so it's very interesting to be able to see the way that, being the first company to implement AI here into a remediation standpoint, where it's going to go, right? Now we just need to know the right questions to ask, but are we even going to get to a point where, we can develop on this more? And do I need to take those automations or do I need to take those configurations and say, run this check once a day, run this check always, right? Make sure this is a part of my baseline and a part of my compliance. So no, it's a very quick demo, but I think that's part of the value there. And what I'm trying to articulate is process that's taking teams a very long time. We're able to go ahead and streamline that. And that actually results in, very concrete dollars very concrete risk reduction, words you've all heard me say already in today's discussion. So like I said, that's mainly what I wanted to share with you all. More than happy to go through some more questions, right? More than happy to review other things. But as we mentioned, this is recorded. We have, resources that'll be sent out, and thank you all for your time, most importantly.